for workforce strategy. He's been a writer and a speaker on the future of work since 2011. With 20 years of experience in consulting, Stephen leads transformations in workforce strategy that enable his clients, people to feel personal purpose and impact as the business drives and improves results. Stephen is the co-author of The Intelligence Revolution, a recent paper covering implications on the future of work, and he has led many projects in the last few years, helping clients build new frameworks and capabilities to stand up future-ready workforces. Please welcome Stephen Harrington.
So much. It is a rare pleasure to get a chance to talk to a room full of people who are interested in talent. I'm really, really pleased to be here today, because usually I have to convert people to thinking that way. So I think we're starting off in the right place. I always want to start with a hypothesis. And by that I mean, one of the things I try and do is come off the fence a little bit about the employment market, which means reasonable adults will disagree. And if you disagree with me, that's great. That's great. There'll be questions, and you can hit me with them and try and set me straight. So the hypothesis is meant to be something that you can think about as I go through my presentation and see if I've brought you in line to agree with me. So I have two hypotheses to share with you today. One's about internal. So it's about thinking about your own workforce and companies in general and how they're operating, and the other is external. So there's a great debate still raging, and I will cover this today, about whether people should work from home. And I'm going to submit as a hypothesis that that's a terrible question. Does anybody agree with me? That's a terrible question. It's a very uninteresting question, because it's either yes or no, and we can fight about whether we think it's productive or not. I think there are more interesting questions that we can ask ourselves, which is, how are we going to differentiate to win talent from our competitors? How might we distribute work to better serve our customers or citizens? Could work from anywhere unlock new opportunities for new services or products that we offer to the market? I'll give you a really quick example. We were working with the CEO of a research company. They were located in Burlington. In 2019, everybody worked in Burlington. This was fine. Nobody was unhappy, because what did they know? The pandemic came along, and of course, her whole workforce wanted to work from home. And she hated that with a passion that only a baby boomer can muster. But in our first conversation with her, we talked about the strategy for her business, and a huge part of it, probably 40% of her business, was influencing hospitals to think differently about care. So our question was simply, what would it look like if some of your people, at least, were located in the same cities, provinces, even right in the hospitals that you're trying to influence? And that changed everything for her. She saw the strategic opportunity for her business and was much more willing to have the conversation, because it was no longer about an HR policy. That's hypothesis number one. Hypothesis number two is a little bit more fun. I think there are three macroeconomic factors that are impacting every business today, no matter what industry you're in, no matter what region. We have very low unemployment rates, which is being hyper-scaled in a way by the retirement boom. We've got a swing in worker preference that we're still trying to understand, and a new phase of game-changing technology. I promise that I'm not at the end of my speech going to say, and by the way, it was all written by generative AI. It's a cute trick, but I decided against it. But it's happening, right? It's happening, and we have to think about these technologies at the same time, because they're going to change workforce. Okay, so today I'm going to cover three things: the myths and realities of the current employment landscape, the human challenges we're going to face over the next decade, and the shifts that are at play and how to manage them. Okay, so first up, CEOs are worried. We have lots of great data that shows us that it's now become one of the greatest issues is talent shortage for CEOs across industries. And just to illustrate how bad it can be, Canada has 5% unemployment. Has it ticked up to 5.2? Does anybody know? That's recessionary pressure, apparently, in 2023. Not great relief in the employment market for those who are feeling they're having shortages. But it can be a lot worse than that. We started doing some work for an ER&I company who operates in the US. We were looking at their Ohio operations, and it turns out that when you look at the actually effective unemployment rate for people that could work for them, the unemployment rate was actually 2%. If unemployment is 2%, you should actually just think there's nobody in the market waiting for your work. What can you do as an employer when you feel like it's possible that there's nobody waiting to work for you? I'm gonna give you an answer. How many HR people are in the room today? Okay, this is for you guys. The answer is to be competitive. And I know that sounds really simple, but the truth is we've trained HR, we've forced HR into being operational and risk management thinkers first, most of the time. Some of you may be lucky and you're working for an employer where that's not true. But the majority of the time, that's the focus of HR, versus what we've been trained to do as business leaders in every other context of our business, which is be different. Apple's got it right. We have to figure out how to be fundamentally different. Does it make sense what I'm saying about HR? When I was in HR, the question was, for that finance analyst, can you tell me how all of our competitors are paying that role? And can we make sure the job description's more or less the same? And if their benefits are slightly different, can we try and compete with that? It's all about competing to the middle, as opposed to stepping out ahead. Yeah? There's a lot going on in the employment market here, as you can see. Estimates say that 39% of the global knowledge workers will be remote or hybrid by the end of this year. So if you're seeing in the press a lot about this debate between the Jamie Dimons of the world who are saying come back into the office and thinking that somehow this is swinging the trend back towards working in the office, the truth is so far it isn't. And what I want to underline today is that's really about preference. 58% of Gen Z say they are drawn to the gig economy because of the flexibility it offers. And by the way, the gig economy is a way of a potential employee saying, I don't want your damn full-time job. I can work for myself. I can generate my own value. I can set my own hours. We're seeing tremendous growth in the gig economy every year. It is on a hockey stick. This is a threat to employers as well. 38% of Canadian workers would say, I quit, if their employer said, come in 5 days a week. Now, there's two things to remember about that stat. One, there's a lot of Canadian workers who would have received that survey question and said, what do you mean? I kept going in 5 days a week through the whole pandemic. And who knows if people will carry through with their threat, but it does tell you that this preference change we saw through the pandemic is sticky. And it's opened up a new competitive landscape. Imagine you've got 5 major employers. Let's say they're the Canadian banks. And one of those banks comes out and says, 5 days a week, everybody. Even if they get a couple of the other banks to go with them because they're smart. What happens when any of the banks in that cluster start suffering for talent? One of the things that will happen is that they will not forget that one of the new competitive landscapes is flexibility. And of course, they'll use it as a weapon against the company that's gone to 5 days. This, I think, is what's going to play out for the foreseeable future. You can't think that you're going to be on the winning side. I think the mindset we need to have is that like pay, like benefits, flexibility is a competitive marker. There's no right or wrong answer, by the way. A 5 day a week in the office strategy is great, as long as your workplace is amazing. Because from a talent strategy perspective, what you're doing is saying, we want all the people who are sick of working from home. We want all the people who are sick of cultures that might be eroding. But you have to double down on whatever strategy you pick. How many folks in this room are in an organization where they're in a set number of days a week? Set number of days a week. How many allow their employees to make up their own minds about when to be in? Oh, it's about split. And how many are 5 days a week in the office? I'm sorry, sir. It's always like one. Oh, it was 2. Are you at the same company? No? Okay, 2. You're not lonely today. 3? Oh, 2 over there. Oh, more over there. Excellent. Okay. I'm going to say something just slightly controversial, especially since so many people put up their hands for set days a week. Out of those 3 strategies, I think set days a week is the most difficult to pull off. In set days a week, what happens is the employees come in on the day they were told, and they're in their teams meeting, just like they would have been at home, and they leave work thinking, I could have stayed home. And by the way, the whole organization doesn't usually come in on the same day. There's so much mismatch, but now it's been hard-coded into this sort of structured policy. It's a lot easier to say, actually, where you work is performance management related. That's the come in when you think you should approach. I hope it's performance management based. Hopefully you can say to an employee, it was weird that we had the innovation session last week and you called from your cottage. That's performance management based approach. Yeah. And 5 days a week is easy because it's saying, actually, we really need to double down on being together. And you're hopefully very clear why, and hopefully your workplace is also differentiated. How many folks also feel like they're on Teams or Zoom meetings 6 to 8 hours a day? Still? Yeah? Maybe half the room? This is another fundamental problem that we're dealing with in the market today, is that the technology that saved us from the pandemic has taken over the way we work. For those that put up their hand, they probably feel like a fair amount of the time they're in meetings that they're like, wait a minute, is this a decision-making meeting? Is this a discussion? Why am I here? Or end the day absolutely exhausted and disengaged. We're seeing a hot labor market during a recession, and the Canadian economy stubbornly continues to add jobs, as much as the bank is trying to hammer that out of them. Also, you can see what job seekers are prioritizing. Obviously, higher salary, it never goes away because people are smart. Benefits have come back as a real competitive market. Gen Z in particular, because they witnessed their parents go through the financial crisis, they want benefits. They want a pension. This is very different than millennials. So thinking about how you make people feel safe has become important again. They want advancement and flexibility. And there's one other thing that's not on my list that we were just looking at data last week. They want cool work. Has anybody come to you saying they want cool work? This is especially true in IT, by the way. IT departments across the country are losing people to cool work every day. They'll leave higher salary for cool work in some job categories. I have good news for you. This all sounds really bad so far. It's coming, it's coming. So we're living in this time where people are beginning to feel like you only live once. My kids say this all the time, it drives me crazy, but it's a fair point. People are choosing employers for work-life balance because they can learn something and for pay. And then they're leaving for pay. That's always been true. Look at what's number 2 though, mental health. Not on the radar until after the pandemic. People are reporting higher levels of burnout, overwork, overburden, and they're switching jobs in the faint hope that the next employer won't do the same thing. And by the way, remember I said earlier, it's not necessarily the employer's fault. It's the way we're working. It's the way the collective market has set a pattern for ways of working that is unsustainable. I do want to have a quick talk about quiet quitting. This term is, sorry, is this mic on as well? It's a quick term, especially for people who think that we should go back to the office. They worry that when people work from home, they're quietly quitting. It wasn't helpful that people started tweeting that and taking pictures of themselves in their backyards, having fun during the workday. But here's the thing I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about. This problem of disengagement is not new at all. The Gallup data, if you've ever looked at it out of the US, it's a global study. It's run for decades, and it's consistently shown that about a third of the workforce at any given time is actively disengaged, meaning they don't see value in their work, they try to avoid work whenever possible. This was true in 2019, as true as it is today. So the only thing that's changed is that people have quietly quit on you from home versus quietly quit from you in the office. It's a red herring. I want to talk quickly about the productivity theater. It's one of my favorite new terms. What I mean by this is I worry that especially in this age of people being online all the time, of a lot of organizations ramping up the way they're measuring their employees, especially the way they're measuring inputs, meaning the amount of time they spend in meetings or the amount of reports they produce or calls they make, is that we're becoming demonstrative when it comes to performance. It's a theater in that I write my goals at the beginning of the year. I write them in such a way as I make sure I can get them. And then I make sure I get my merit increase. And I fill out my reports and I do my administration, all to prove that I'm productive, as opposed to actually being productive. The big shift that we're trying to work on in the workforce strategy space is to try and get employers as much as possible, instead of talking about inputs of work and measuring those, to look at outcomes of work and measuring those and valuing those over inputs. If you want to be a really radical thinker about this, by the way, you would say the future is outcomes, not inputs, because at some point, so much of what we do will be automated that looking at inputs is going to become a kind of bizarre approach. And trust has been shown time again. We have a great psychologist in the room who could probably underline this for us. Trust has been underlined over and over again as one of the most important drivers of engagement. So, as I said, I think the debate is largely over on whether or not people prefer flexibility and prefer to work from home. The debate is not over about employer power and how they're going to play that strategy over time. I think, if you're going to talk about hybrid work, a more productive conversation than a policy is to talk to people about what works well in person and what works well remotely. And by the way, this is not data that we had to scramble together over the last few years. This has been studied ad nauseum for over 20 years. We've long known that idea generation, networking, development, collision, and apprenticeship, perhaps most importantly, work better in person. Hopefully it makes sense what I mean by apprenticeship. I don't mean trades. I mean literally every organization has some version of apprenticeship, meaning that you learn really well from the people you sat next to in person. It's very difficult to pull that off when you're remote. Somebody was saying to me, this is the lonely century, was it? Was that what the book was? Yeah. So you can imagine people trying to do those things on their own at home, and imagine how difficult that is and the challenges that creates. Idea prioritization you can do on your own. And you get these other benefits. You get the dedicated heads down time, which actually, hopefully, ironically, even though we worry so much about it, drives productivity, reduces quit rates. Okay, let's talk about the next decade, because it's going to be weird. The first thing I want to talk to you about is human-machine collaboration. There's a mindset that we all have around technology I think we have to shake ourselves out of. And it's essentially that starting in the 90s, it became clear that technology was going to change work. So we tacked this department onto the side of the business and we called it IT. And at first they were only wiggling cables. Is anybody in IT here today? I'm not making fun of you, I'm just, Right? It was wiggling cables in 1990. But it became a lot more than that. It became one of the ways that strategy came true by creating new capabilities. But generally speaking, the mindset of the organization was, how do we use technology to replace humans? Which is great. It's productivity improving, economists like it, shareholders like it. It was a very important mindset. But it's reached its logical limit because now technology could, with generative AI, within the next 10 years, automate anything. And I hope it's clear that I'm not exaggerating. Anything. Writing a script, producing a video, creating images. I'll tell you a story that will probably be true in professional services, just to make it about a firm that I know very well for a moment. Like a lot of our competitors, we've jealously created a knowledge management system over the last 20 years, where people create great collateral, they cleanse it to make sure that clients aren't exposed, and then they put it up on the knowledge management system, and that thing's grown for 20 years. And everybody hates it to death because you can't find anything on it. It's too much information. It's impossible. We actually have junior practitioners that spend hours combing through global stuff to try and find the right thing. Well, it's very likely that in the next year, we'll liberate that data, all of it, into a large language model, so that in the future, that junior practitioner can simply ask a question and get an answer based on the collective knowledge of 20 years of professional services. And by the way, if we plug that thing into Microsoft Copilot or a number of other organizational tools out there, we'll be able to take that and say, well, actually, can you take that answer and turn it into a PowerPoint presentation for me? And have it done in 90 seconds. What kind of questions does that raise about the business that we're going to be running? If we had if we had the IT mindset that I just described earlier, which is let's replace people, the first thing we'll do is replace all of the most junior people in our organization. Right? Because I just described that's where they spend all their time. Now, I'm in a room of HR professionals. I'm sure you're already spotting the incredibly bad idea that is. We were talking about apprenticeship models a minute ago. You would destroy it. We already saw this happen. It happened in the legal industry at the start of the 2010s. There was a huge amount of automation that came in and replaced articling student work, and like good corporate thinkers, a lot of legal firms maximized the use of that technology, and their organization went from being pyramid-shaped to diamond-shaped. And with only a few years, they couldn't find enough people to be intermediate lawyers or senior lawyers because they'd hollowed out their own apprenticeship model. Darn, I said I was going to sound hopeful. Here's the hopeful part. Augmentation is a very different mindset. In an augmentation mindset, what we do instead is we say, how could these technologies be companions to our workers? Working alongside with them, informing them, not making decisions for them. That's the best thing about generative AI technology, is that generative AI technology works best when you have a dialogue with it. I keep trying to teach my kids this. See if you can teach your kids, because they're using it, but what they tend to do is go, can you write my essay for me on Canadian history? And they get the answer. But what I want them to do is say, read it, first of all, and then ask questions, because that's what the AI is able to do. Dig deeper, dig another level deeper. Say, I don't agree with that. Give me another alternative. The AI is perfectly capable of doing that out of the box today. That ability to have dialogue versus answer seeking is going to be a huge skill of the future. I just wanted to demonstrate really quickly that generative AI is not new in the least. It's simply an evolution of technologies that started in the 50s. We have been waiting for the moment of true general AI since 1956. This is one of the things I love about the future of work, by the way. We actually already know all the things that are going to happen. The only debate is when. And we're living through one of those when moments right now. Don't boo me, because I'm going to say something else. I don't know if you're generative AI, like, that's probably enough. You'd be like, okay, well, let's take that back. Let's think about it for a couple of years. Let's get that sorted. The challenge is going to be, I think this next decade is going to have a number of bumps. Within 6 months, some people, the prediction just came out last week from a few major academic institutions that quantum AI applications are only 6 months away. And that's a whole other universe of technological change for corporations to try and resolve. And by the way, what happens when you put quantum computing and generative AI together? We're going to find out. Generative AI today can do a lot of things quite simply. If you haven't played with ChatGPT, do it. It's free. It's one of the best things about it. It can obviously produce text that's similar to the text in a training data set. The thing about ChatGPT, by the way, like, you can build much simpler models. The reason ChatGPT is blowing our minds is because it's the collective intelligence of the entire internet. So that's a lot of data. It can code. It doesn't code perfectly, but most people that we have experimenting with it say it can code 80% of what you ask it for most of the time. And it's getting better. The next version's coming out soon. It can create images, and it can create videos. This is what has governments around the world scratching their heads about what they're going to do. Because you could, if you wanted, spend a weekend and figure out how to create a video of a public figure making a statement. It's not that hard. The tools are all there. How, in the future, are we going to be able to tell the difference between what is being told to us truthfully and what might be fake? We can augment, we can personalize, we can automate, we can create, we can simulate. Look, the whole reason the talent guy's up here telling you about this is because this is the most human technology that we've seen come out into the market. And it can absolutely be used to either automate or augment. The choice is entirely up to us as employers. And I think we need to have the conversation and think about how this fits into our talent strategy. It could be so liberating. One of the easiest use cases, if your company has any large data set that's publicly available, then you don't need to worry about owning your own generative AI, which is good because owning your own is expensive. So for an example, if you were a government employer, and by the way, this happened to the government. Did anybody see Tax GPT? See the news about that? It was right here in Ottawa. There was an enterprising Canadian who saw 3.5 come out, and what he said to himself was, I think I know of a large data set of publicly available information. It's the Canadian tax code. And he put the whole thing into a GPT. You can go to it yourself next tax season and ask that chatbot any question you want about tax, and it's going to return you answers. And you can, by the way, do what I described. You can have a dialogue with it. Who should have built that tool? That's right. That's right. But now imagine that you're a worker that works a lot with these huge, complex policies. Wouldn't it be great to have a chat assistant where you can just ask it questions instead of flipping through endless pages of manuals? Wouldn't it be great to have that if you were in customer service and you wanted to answer questions for clients more easily? It's here now. I'm not talking about the future. Okay, here are the big shifts. I'm going to do this really quickly because I want time for questions. These are the big shifts we're seeing in the market for employers today, and they're a little bit of a to-from game. We're seeing a big shift from jobs to skills. The history of the modern job is not that old. It's so ingrained in the way we run our businesses that we forget that it's not that long ago that we just decided on creating things like job descriptions, right? That's a relatively recent invention. And one of the reasons we did it is because we needed some sort of analog way to agree on how to trade talent. So we all agreed that there's such a thing as a finance analyst. It's a completely made up thing, guys. But we just agreed, and then we created a fairly common job description that's true across most industries so we could more effectively trade talent. Well, we did that at a time when we didn't have access to data. And actually, if you think about it, jobs are just a proxy to skills. What you're really hoping for when you hire somebody is they have the right skills to be effective in your business. You're just hoping that the container of the job contains those. And then, guys, HR guys, you all agree with me, half the time they don't. No matter how good a job you do in recruiting, and you have to build those skills into those people, which is why we're so disappointed when the average Canadian leaves their job 2.5 years later. Some of these stats just blow my mind. So what we're moving to instead is the skills-based organization. We're seeing more and more global employers, they always go first, they've got deep pockets, beginning to do skills analytics at scale to try and understand what skills they need, which they're missing, and how to go into internal talent marketplaces and external and trade on those skills as opposed to on the jobs. We're also seeing this move, which we've seen for quite a while, from thinking just about the employees that you have within your workforce to workforce ecosystems. Talent is everywhere. Michael was saying it off the top, talent's in this room, an incredible amount of talent in this room. And you're going to exchange information today, and it's going to add value for your businesses. The contractors that work for you are talent. In some businesses, we just let procurement deal with those folks. It's highly transactional, but they have skills, they have hopes, they have dreams. They also have favored employers and less than favored employers. Why aren't we competing for all the talent? Why only the ones we pay? And why did I flip from my slide? Where am I? Moving away from flexing work to flexing everything. I talked a little bit about that, but it means try not just to think about whether people should work from home, but how flexibility in general as an organizing principle for an organization could create more value and how people fit into that. Automation to augmentation, and I also hinted at moving from this constrained idea of productivity being widgets per hour to this idea of human performance, outcomes. I'm going to skip most of these, but I want to spend a little bit of time on jobs to skills. There's something that you can do for your organization without my help or anybody's. There's lots of tools out there. I don't know if you've heard of organizations like Skyhive or Eightfold AI or Future Fit AI. These are all new startups, relatively new, last 5 or 6 years, that are building these incredibly large skills taxonomies, and you can dump your workforce into them and you can come up with all kinds of crazy conclusions. It's great, but it's not for everybody. So what we've been doing with most employers is a much simpler pattern to get into skills-based thinking. So imagine, especially my HR friends, you go sit down with your business that's hurting the most. It's probably IT. Yeah. And you say to them, what's your strategy? What are you trying to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years? Don't ask them about skills. Don't ask them about jobs. Get them thinking about what they're trying to achieve, and then ask them, what's going to be hard about that? What do you need to be good at that you either don't have enough of or you're missing altogether? That's your skills taxonomy. That's what you focus them on. And then you tie those skills to roles, job segments. Say, okay, who needs to learn those skills roughly? Not individuals, but probably job segments. And here's the most important part. Then we work through in detail, how are you going to build, buy, borrow, or bot those skills? So build being training, buy being hiring, borrow being a really good idea sometimes, and bot being automate. Most organizations do not, what's incredible when we take organizations through that process is often the business feels like for the first time they have a detailed plan for how they're going to close skill gaps. And they can cost it, and they can execute it. Rather than continuing to hope that hiring the right jobs is somehow going to magically improve capability and capacity. Okay, we talked enough about all this nonsense. Why can't I go forward anymore? Where am I pointing, guys? Okay, last 2 points, and then I'd love to hear questions. in order to take the chaos that I've been describing on the left-hand side, the key shifts, and to make it true for your organization, one of the most important things you can do is try to think about 3 things at the same time. And we're not generally oriented as organizations to do this. You'll notice as I talk about these 3 things, they tend to be given to different departments to think about separately. First of all, work. How are people working? What technologies are they using that could make their lives simpler? This is one of the most, remember I said we need to be different? Imagine you could just take that generative AI tool, take the most transactional stuff out of your most important jobs, and then go brag to the employment market about it. People will want to work for you if you can say to them, I used the finance analyst example before, so I'll use it again. Come work for us. We've automated the Excel spreadsheet nonsense. You'll be training to be a finance business partner day 1, or go work for our competitor. Have fun with that stuff. They pay a little bit more. Who do you think they're going to choose? Why do I keep fast forwarding? And then the next is workforce. So I have no idea why I keep moving forward. The next is workforce. So how is it composed? How do you think about those combinations of jobs, of contractors, of vendors, of technologies in ways that are going to make your strategy actually work? And then finally, workplace. How are we going to make sure that the workplace is a magnet for people if we're 5 days a week, if we're structured in the office, especially if we're allowing people to come in whenever they feel like it? The workplace should be an event. The workplace mindset has to completely change. Okay, I'm just going to leave this slide up here for your consideration because you're all leaders in this room. And the one thing I haven't covered today, because it's a whole other topic, is how brutally unfair your job is today. All of our data indicates that leaders, I talked about burnout briefly before, leaders are suffering badly in 2023. They were through the pandemic, but the less than good news is it's continued post-pandemic. Overwork, burnout, early retirements, people really struggling to understand how to manage hybrid workforces and do it effectively, and even more work, especially in the middle layer. And when I say work, I mean sleeves rolled up, doing the work of the front line being done by managers because we're so capacity crunched. And so we need to think deeply, I think, about the role of leaders in the future, and it's got to change because the context has changed. We got to be bridge builders, which is trust building, purpose creators. Strategy is going to keep changing. Purpose doesn't. Most organizations are unable to really clearly articulate their purpose in a way that gets people excited, customers and employees. Ecosystem orchestrators. Why do it alone? Michael's trying to help us with that today. Connection facilitators. And work-life advocates. Because trust me, everybody's struggling with how to make hybrid work. Your leaders and your employees, and they need advice for how to manage this work-life balance. Okay, I struggled a little bit with my clicker, but I hope that was a helpful presentation. I'd love to take any questions, any provocations, especially if anybody agrees or disagrees with the hypothesis today.
So you talked a lot about issues of your workplace ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so that leads to a discussion about culture. And I think it's something we don't talk about enough, that overwhelmingly we kind of reap what we sow. So that if we create workplaces and spaces where, again, you said, oh, well, somebody tweeted online that they were working from home and having a good time or whatever. Like, I think the cultural aspect, the legacy of this sort of flinty-eyed old Anglo-Protestant, God forbid somebody should be having fun somewhere. I mentioned that the federal government eliminated the ability to easily buy muffins for your staff. Like, we have this really part of our culture is this real suspicion with anybody having a good time anywhere. And yet we weren't always that way. I was doing a history project this summer on the history of the RA Center, the recreation center that the federal government built in the mid-1950s for its employees. It had leadership from key people in the Jewish community, I think because they understood that sport is one of those things, culture, that brings people together and builds relationships. And the opening picture is Diefenbaker rolling a bowling ball. It's about having fun, and we have forgotten that. So it's no wonder work is so miserable. The cultural that we let take over is awful. Any comment?
Yeah, I do have a comment, and because I agree. Like, if you're an employer, I think you have a huge opportunity to think about the culture you want to create and focus on what I said at the beginning, which is how are you going to be different, and then be unafraid to do things differently. I think that's a big part of the answer. But here's another challenge to throw onto the fire with what you just gave us. Think about digital calendars. So all of us have one, Microsoft has one, Google has one. What does it communicate to us? What does that technology say? It says that our life is 15 to 30 minute increments that anybody can take at a whim. And we begin to work on that clock, that incredibly pressure-filled clock, to maximize the use of that digital calendar. That is the technology driving the culture. How do we escape that? It's going to take, to your point, really thoughtful strategy around culture to say, for an example, I've got one employer in Toronto who said, all meetings are optional. This was the CEO's big announcement. To the rank and file. So if you get invited to a meeting and you don't think it's important, don't go. Now, he was clear that performance management is in the backdrop. If you're making silly decisions, we're probably going to ask you questions. But it put all the pressure on the organizer of the meeting to make sure it was valuable use of time and that they hadn't invited people that shouldn't be there. So I think these are the sorts of moves. That's just one example. There are probably dozens that we need to start to think about so that we can intentionally build the cultures we want. Because I think some organizations are trying very hard to build these positive cultures, but there are things getting in the way that aren't being discussed. Yes?
I'm one of those baby boomers with the booming voice, the mom's voice, I talked about earlier. I have my challenges. Thank you. My challenges come from the fact that a lot of those people were hired to work in their business, in their office, in whatever it was, pre-COVID. Mm-hmm. And now they don't think that they think the right is to stay working from home. Thus, all the empty offices,
yes,
all of the issues that we're facing in our economy because of it. Is it really fair if you were hired for that position 10, 15, 20 years ago, that now you just choose to elect to be the person that works from home, sort of, or actually works? I'm very concerned about what it's doing to our city.
Absolutely. It's a really good question. I mean, especially in Ottawa. I actually traveled the country in the summer of 2020, because I don't know if you guys remember, but for like 2 weeks there, we thought the pandemic was over. So I was in Toronto, I was in Calgary, I was in Vancouver, and I came back to Ottawa, and I came to downtown Ottawa. Out of all those cities, downtown Ottawa was a ghost town. You could have filmed an apocalypse movie in Ottawa. But I think it's important to remember one of the reasons those cities were different, especially Toronto and Ottawa, great example, is far more people live in downtown Toronto than live in downtown Ottawa. So the capital side of the economy, even though it suffered, it managed to hold on because it wasn't so beholden to commuters. So I actually think part of the answer is to get more people living in downtown Ottawa. I love the idea of, and I know it's being explored, of some of the empty office space in Ottawa being turned over to housing. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. It would help bolster the downtown economy, and I'm sure business will follow. Where there are people, there is business. What I worry about is if, as a city, we said, we need people in the office, what we'll do, because worker preferences changed, is that we're actually going to make it tremendously hard for those employers to maintain their workforce. And our economy will be hurt in other ways. By the way, I also think there's a tremendous opportunity in the suburbs of Ottawa. Those people who are working from home are consumers, and we've never thought of them as consumers from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. What are the new businesses that could crop up to support those people in those regions? I guess the short answer to your question is, as much as I'd love to be able to dictate people coming back, because I'm an office body myself, I just don't think it'll work. And it really comes down to psychology, is my position. Once you give somebody autonomy and trust, in any context, and you try and take it back away again, they absolutely refuse. Or they're upset, one or the other.
Thank you for the plethora of facts. So many people know that
Yeah, I'm not sure you're on.
Hello? Yeah, it's good. It's good? Yeah. Okay. So what I'm about to say is not boasting, but I spent 35 wonderful years in hospitality. I had 2 great mentors that were almost slave drivers, Michael, right? Because they expected Steve to be there many hours. When I hired people, I'd say, Michael, you're starting tomorrow and you're going to work Mother's Day, Father's Day, New Year's Eve, and probably 6 days a week. I wouldn't be able to say that today to many people. So when we talk about work-life balance, what are people in the service industry that are 24/7 going to do? And how will we be, what's the implication going to be? Because if that person, the manager is not there, he doesn't have employees who care, they'll just ghost or leave.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Is there a question in there somewhere?
No, there is. You know, it's funny, one of the other trends we saw in the last year in hourly work, in frontline work, is what they were calling onboarding ghosting. So what people were doing is, because there's such pressure in hourly wage jobs, is that people would accept multiple offers, go to the first day of onboarding, and if they didn't like it, they just ghost it and go to the next one. And the turnover rate in hourly work has gone through the roof. This is really important to understand, because even though there's a huge amount of the Canadian workforce, up to 60% of the Canadian workforce, who can't work from home because they're tied to a location or a field or a retail outlet, they know the promise has changed. They know the social contract has changed. And they feel that. And they're looking for a new deal, even though there isn't one. So it's why when we're working with some organizations, we worked with a nuclear operation, for an example, which obviously needs people on site. Thank God they are, for safety reasons, if nothing else, right? But what we established for them was a principle we called something for everyone. So thank you for this question, because I think this is a really important point. The something for everyone principle said that actually flexibility isn't just about where you work, it's also about when and how. I'll give you the really quick example. They had a whole bunch of field inspectors who in 2019 would have commuted like the rest of us to get to their office, only to pick up the company truck and their orders for the day and go back on the road. So the little tweak they made in that job category was they said, oh, we're going to try and work with the insurance companies and get the company truck in your driveway so you don't need to commute. Out of all the work we did for that organization, the happiest work segment was that one, even though to me, that sounded so minor. But to them, it was hours per week, hundreds of hours per year that we just gave them back through a really simple tweak in the how, not the where. So I think, and by the way, I do think there are still people out there that are willing to work. I work in professional services 50 to 60 hours a week. Some businesses still need that. We do. It just means we have to be really clear about our value proposition. It's one of the reasons why I think firms like ours have said work wherever you want, because we're trying to balance the overall value proposition. Yes, you're going to work very hard, but we're going to trust you to the maximum, and you can work whatever way you want to get to those outcomes, is what's working for us.
Hello. Just a quick point on learning and development.
Yes.
Have to say it. The thing about working from home that I always think about is the learning and development opportunity for people entering the workforce and even throughout your career. I think about my career and how I've gotten to where I am. I can tell you I wouldn't be where I am if I was sitting at home. Mm-hmm. The allied relationships that you build, the osmosis that happens in an office, it's just a point, not really a question, but like that's my concern about the hybrid or however which way you go is what happens to the learning and the transfer of that trust and information sharing.
Yeah, no, you're bang on. I know I mentioned it a bit earlier, but apprenticeship models are really in trouble in most organizations. And when I came into my firm, for a year, I sat next to a whole bunch of other people who'd also just come in, and none of us knew what the hell we were doing. But we could turn to each other and go, how did you do that? How did you do that? That was easy. I do think one of the things that's happening is the new generations are finding ways to use digital tools to try and recreate that moment. But like you, I'm a fan of when there's true learning that needs to happen, especially if it's event-based, come together. I'll tell you a really quick story about, we have a university at Deloitte University. There are 6 of them around the world. One of them's in Westlake, Texas, on a ranch. So it's in the middle of nowhere. And I've always said the learning there is about 60% ribs, 10% beer, and then there's some learning. And it's done that way for a reason, because what we really want, we want people to learn. We do it on a milestone basis, so they've gotten into a new job. We want them to meet everybody else who had the same experience, who are also new to that job, form connections that will last. And this really came home in 2021 when the US was able to send their first cohort back to the university following COVID. They could only get about 40% of the cohort out because some people refused and there were still COVID restrictions, but it allowed for this incredible experiment. And it turned out that people that went to Deloitte University for 2 days were 5 times less likely to leave the firm than those that didn't go. And that just blew my mind, because it suggests that it's not, and this is why I'm not a fan of the structured days a week solution, because the idea is the same. The idea is if we can get people in structured, they'll form those connections and we'll improve retention and all that good stuff. But this kind of proved that if it's 2 days out of 365, if it's the right 2 days, and it feels like an investment in those people, it can have an incredible and lasting effect. I hope I reinforced your point. One more.
Hello. I'm just wondering if you could address, I'm listening to what you're saying and I buy into much of it, but my concern is that we deliver services in rural areas.
Yes.
Rural areas that don't have reliable internet.
Yes.
Rural areas that don't have large employers who can afford to do a lot of the things that you're talking about. And where does small business and where do people who don't have those advantages fit?
Thank you. Excellent question. So 2 things. One, I think one of the most important conversations that's been buried in the last 5 years is the right to connect in Canada. Because it was bad 10 years ago where we already knew that huge amount of business value and educational value is flowing through high-speed connections. And for people to still be without high-speed connections in Canada is a shame. It's also even more of a shame in Indigenous communities across the country, where it's just reinforcing inequality. So I really hope that we can get back to that conversation. There are new technologies, as I'm sure everybody knows, that is making the distribution of high speed easier. It's just not cost effective enough yet. And maybe we need to look at subsidy. But the other thing I wanted to say was, when it comes to being a small or medium enterprise, a lot of what I'm talking about actually gets easier. Now, I spend most of my time working with large employers, 2 ridiculously large employers. And their biggest problem is, if they want to make any one of the, I talked about those 5 shifts, if they might want to make any one of those 5 shifts, it is going to take them years because they have to unwind the complexity of the way they've always done things. They have to redesign programs and run huge change management practices. I used to work almost primarily with the trucking industry. And there's a ton of small and medium enterprises in that. And a lot of the best companies were really good at quickly coming up with an idea that would make a change and instituting it at the lowest cost possible. The other thing that's making that more and more possible, I didn't have a chance to talk about it today, but it's fascinating. The last 15 years has been really about the rise of the enterprise technology, of the big, expensive technologies that fundamentally change businesses. But right now, we're seeing a huge influx of small, cheap, and cheerful technologies that actually take modules out of those enterprise techs and do them better. So for an example, there's a great Canadian company in Kitchener-Waterloo region called Plum. They do psychometric testing at low-cost scale. And if you put them together with another great North American company, Nocri, that automates resume screening, you can make your hiring process just hum and have recruiters spend almost all of their time focusing on recruiting and sourcing as opposed to administration. The cost is incredibly low. And so I think it's a bit of a mindset shift for small and medium enterprises to start to look at those technologies seriously and build an architecture of those and leapfrog what the larger companies are able to do. All right, thank you very much.